Let me start here and just define that, at least in some places in the world, we define high blood pressure here by a systolic value that exceeds 140. Now, that's been a bit of a number in play because of the issues with respect to the sprint trial and other things, but somewhere in the 130 to 140 range, measured a few times, as I'll show you in a second, that seems to be a reasonable cut point for how we define an elevated blood pressure. What we do with it is another issue, but at least in terms of defining what we mean by hypertension, hypertension is a disorder where we think the elevated blood pressure, if it's reduced, the benefits of reducing it on preserving the heart, the brain, and the kidneys will outweigh any of the risks that we see from the medications and the lifestyle factors that we suggest in the management process. How many times do we need to measure a blood pressure on someone before we diagnose them with high blood pressure? Interesting question. Only a very small amount of data really exists to answer this question, but this primary care practice study from the UK, which you can see has a little bit of gray hair on it, it's about 1983, so that's 34 years old. But what Hartley and his colleagues did in the UK, and sorry for the lack of the T there, it looks like it's Hartley, they looked at 110 newly diagnosed patients with diastolics of 190 to 110 in the office, and they said, if you continue to bring them back and measure them, not uncommonly, some of them will fall below that 90. That's so-called regression to the mean. And how many times do I need to bring someone back, recheck it, and say, I'm pretty sure you do have high blood pressure? And the answer in this particular study, and which has stood the test of time and has been incorporated into many guidelines around the world, is you need 3 outpatient visits, and typically with at least 2 blood pressures done each time. And if you continue to fall above whatever the threshold value is for systolic or diastolic blood pressure in your population, then you can be pretty confident that someone has high blood pressure. The other interesting thing that was emphasized in this article in the British Medical Journal is that the timing, should I let 1 week go by, 1 day go by, a month go by? I mean, how much time do I wait between visits to check blood pressure for those 3 times before I diagnose someone? It turns out it doesn't matter. In the States, we typically do a 1 to 2 week interval, but other parts of the world, it may be more convenient to do a different time. It doesn't matter. As long as you've done it on 3 different occasions and demonstrated that it's high, for systolic or diastolic or both on all 3 occasions, and you're pretty much good to go in terms of the diagnosis. Now, I mentioned a little bit about proper measurement. This study is fascinating. I don't think we could do it today because this had an arterial line in the radial artery of patients in Italy. So this is from Giuseppe Mancia's group in Milan. And when you walk into a room, a patient's room, the moment a physician or a healthcare provider walks into the room, and whether they're a doctor or a nurse, it doesn't matter. The moment you walk into that room, you startle, you do something to the brainstem of these patients that are kind of lying there waiting to have their blood pressure checked. And these are the intra-arterial recordings. And there's an effect of just having a healthcare provider in the presence of a patient that raises blood pressure, even before you start to squeeze that cuff and inflate it. So just bear in mind that the very measurement of blood pressure itself does introduce a little bit of a what we call white coat phenomenon, simply because we're measuring it. In general, doctors tend to have more pronounced an effect on blood pressure when walking into the room and measuring it than nurses do. You notice, though, if you wait a little while, that effect tends to wear off. And this is the reason why, for example, in the American Heart Association guidelines for measurement of blood pressure, we recommend you sit for 5 minutes comfortably with your feet on the floor, back supported, all that kind of stuff, before the first measurement is taken. And then we typically take at least 2 and preferably 3 blood pressures at a visit, because even with letting some time pass and all the troubles in the brainstem settle down, you still have a little bit of elevation on that first reading compared to the second and third. We call that the alerting reflex, largely because the Italians, through Mancia and his crowd, have given us that term. And it's a brainstem alerting term. The first time that cuff goes off, it gives a response from the sympathetic system that raises blood pressure 2 to 4 points on average. The second and third one are typically 2 to 4 points lower than the first one. We tend to use the average of the second and third for the visit of record. When we were doing disease management, we tried to protocolize how you should measure blood pressure, taking this a big document from the American Heart Association and really putting it into some very simple steps that are relatively straightforward. And the word we use in the States is actionable. Can it be done, and can I measure whether it's been done? And so there's 2 slides here. This goes through the first 6 steps. This is not rocket science. This is basic medicine. If you want to take a blood pressure correctly and try and use it to influence a patient's health, you need to let them sit for a few minutes with their feet on the floor and the back supported. In the States, for example, in the United States, for example, we not uncommonly take a blood pressure while a patient's sitting on an exam room table, not in a chair, and their feet are dangling in the air and their back is unsupported. And that creates a problem. The brainstem responds to that lack of placement of your feet, that lack of support in your back, and raises blood pressure. The patient's arm should be supported, not dangling free in the air. The bell actually picks up lower frequency sounds a little better, and that Karatkov disappearance, that 5th Karatkov sound is a low one. And you can read the other things here. We typically take both arms. You should separate readings by a little bit of time, preferably 2 minutes, but at least 1 minute between readings. And it helps to know what the response is of blood pressure in the sitting and standing position. Extra credit if you can take it lying as well. One of the more common errors in blood pressure measurement is the use of a cuff that is too small. If you put a tiny cuff on a big arm, you have to put an awful lot of pressure into that cuff, more than really is needed to collapse the artery and reduce flow, and it hurts. So between the undercuffing to try and get the artery collapsed and the pain involved from having this thing overinflated, you're going to raise blood pressure artificially 10, 20 points in some people. So a proper size cuff. And if you're not sure what the proper size cuff is, figure out how large the circumference of the arm is, and the bladder, the inflatable portion of the cuff, should cover 80% of that circumference. If you're not sure and it's a close call, use the bigger cuff. Err on the side of caution. You want to hit the first and the last sound, and don't do digit bias. The cuffs are made for, in most places have an aneroid. Mercury is largely gone, so an aneroid. The aneroids are gauged in 2s, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 0. If you put a 5 in, you have rounded, because it doesn't measure a 5. It measures a 4 or a 6. And that rounding thing here, especially since many people kind of congregate in a Gaussian fashion right around the cut points for high blood pressure, and you can actually move them up or below that cut point based upon rounding. So put the right number in, what you actually heard. Now take a look at this gentleman here. This is a slide that I got from a fellow in the US named Will Germino. Will is a family practice doc that does primary care, and he put this slide together for a group that does medical education called PrimeEd in the US. And this is a patient in his office. And just look at this guy for a second here. And you will find that there are actually 6 errors in blood pressure measurement being taken here. The first is that the cuff is over a kind of thick garment. So that's not on bare skin. Preferably the cuff should go on bare skin. Secondly, the size of the cuff is actually the regular size, not the large size. This is a pretty large guy. His legs are dangling. His back is not supported, nor is his arm supported, and he's talking. So the number of errors here is 6. And if you think that I'm overreacting to blood pressure being measured correctly, I will share with you this study that we did in the US of medical delegates. So these are guys and gals from medical schools in the US that were sent to the American Medical Association's annual convention in Chicago, US, in the state of Illinois, in the year 2015 in the month of June. And Mike Raycox, the first author here, is now the leader of the chronic disease prevention branch of the AMA. And Mike and I were talking on the phone about the challenges we face with blood pressure, which is a chronic disease, one we would like to prevent. And I told him, Mike, you know, the average medical student doesn't know how to take a blood pressure correctly. And he was dumbfounded. And so we designed a study to look into that. And the long and the short of this particular thing is that we took 159 students from 37 medical schools in the US. And we asked them, have you been taught how to take a blood pressure? Yes, I know how to take a blood pressure. Oh, great. So here, go do one. And meanwhile, the person they're taking the blood pressure from, the person sitting in the chair waiting to have their blood pressure measured, is a trained observer and has a little mental checklist for the 11 steps that are necessary. I showed you most of them in that slide, that pair of slides a few slides ago. One student out of the 159 did all 11 steps correctly, one. And so got a perfect grade. But let's just say 70% might be a passing grade. It was in medical school, for example. So 70% of 11 would be about 7 or 8 steps done correctly. The number average that were done correctly was 4 out of the 11. Certainly not 7, not even 6 or 5, 4 out of the 11. So if I seem to be perseverating on measurement of blood pressure and doing it correctly, it's largely because it isn't done correctly, despite people thinking they are doing it correctly.